City Manager Paul Johnson is providing an update on the city's long-term financial plan. Let's go there live.
Treaty 13 and the Mississaugas of the credit. My name is Lindsay Broadhead. I'm the city's new Chief Communications Officer. It's great to be here. We're sitting today with Paul Johnson, City Manager, and Stephen Conforti, who's our interim Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer. The format of today is fairly straightforward. We're going to go through some slide decks which are behind you. So for the journalists here, you can look behind. Those will also be distributed and available afterwards, so everyone will have access. The presentation itself will be about 20 minutes. We will go through a Q&A afterwards, which will follow typical form, one question, one follow-up, and then we'll circle back to you if there are other questions needed to be asked. But otherwise, we can start. So with that, Paul.
Well, thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Today, we released a report publicly that will be discussed at the Executive Committee of City Council next Thursday, and then go to a special council meeting early in September that really sets out how we can better build the health and sustainability of the City of Toronto. This long-term financial planning work is not new. Successive city managers have done it in some ilk, but what is new and what has changed is the pressure that this city is under to finally begin to address some of these structural challenges that, quite frankly, hold this city back. The context for this discussion is really the fact that Toronto is the economic engine for this country and obviously for this province. Needs and requires a greater share of some of those financial realities in order to be sustainable in the long term. And you'll hear this as a theme throughout today. I want to stress that that does not mean for 1 minute that Toronto will not step up and do what it needs to do. In fact, we have in the past, we are doing so today, and will continue to do so. Torontonians do understand the investments that they need to make in order to make this city strong. But it simply will not be enough over the next decade and the decades to come in order to sustain this great city. As you know, because we've shared these stats repeatedly, Toronto contributes greatly, over 50% of the GDP of this province and a fifth of the GDP of the country of Canada. And we are a city that is home to a number of things that generate activity in the economic sphere and taxes which do not stay locally. Our $50 billion capital plan is wonderful because those are investments in the necessary capital improvements in this city. But the reality is that the supplies that are purchased in order to build those capital items, the workforce that is hired to deliver those items, those sales taxes, those income taxes are not accessible to the City of Toronto. And so as a city that operates the largest transit system in this country, as a city that hosts national and international headquarters, is home to some of the largest scale and most iconic events in this country, contributes billions annually in sales and income taxes, it's time to start to talk about things in a different way for the City of Toronto. And there has been lots of discussion recently about immigration. Acutely, that has manifested itself in a situation with increased numbers of refugees. But when we step back and think about newcomers coming to the City of Toronto, we embrace that. We always have and will continue to. But if we can't have a new relationship with senior levels of government around how we will welcome those newcomers into this community, we will struggle to meet their goals and our goals collectively. The framework that the City of Toronto operates under from a fiscal perspective is long-standing in its challenges, and I'll get to why it's changed in its urgency in just a second. We rely on property-based tools to generate revenue, as do most municipalities. So the reality is, as you see in the report, and our interim Chief Financial Officer will share with you, most of the things we're proposing are variations on how we look at the property-based pieces, whether it's commercial or residential. We do not have the tools to capture the growth that goes on in this community each and every day and continues as we prosper. We do know that the scope and scale and complexity of the services that we deliver are changing, and they are not getting any easier. We deliver services that are more and more an extension of provincial or federal responsibilities. And while we do receive large investments for some of those programs, we continue to subsidize additionally on top of that. Long-term care would be a great example, where approximately 20% of the operating costs of our long-term care facilities, which are of the highest quality, are borne by the property taxpayers in Toronto. When you think about things like our approach around homelessness and our shelter system, our per capita number of shelter spaces is the largest in the country and far outstrips any communities that surround us here in Ontario. And we deliver regional benefits by having a transit system like the TTC that moves people in and out of this community as they live, work, play, and learn in Toronto. The growing demands for our services are evident. Regardless of the class of service you look at, more people are demanding those services. And like all municipalities, and certainly all major municipalities, we have a critical backlog of infrastructure issues which must be addressed. But some of those things are not new. So why the urgency at the moment? Well, our financial environment has changed dramatically. The sustained pandemic impacts, although we are out of the crisis of the pandemic, and I wholly agree with that, we are living with COVID-19 and our communities are coming back to life in that aftermath of the crisis we went through. We have sustained impacts. The TTC is a great example of that. We're at about 75% overall ridership of our pre-pandemic levels. But when you dig into the numbers a bit differently, you understand the hangover of the pandemic. Because things like students are closer to 90%. Our, what I'll call leisure travel and weekend travel, sometimes is about 150% of the pre-pandemic levels. So people are using our transit system, in some cases, almost as much as they were pre the pandemic, or in some cases, even more. But then we get to the commuters, those who use it to get to work each and every day. That class of TTC users is only back at 56% of the ridership pre-pandemic, fully 20%, nearly 20% below the overall rate. That is the hangover of a changed work environment to which the pandemic is largely responsible. And then we have the other things that are challenging us globally. Rising inflation, the increased interest rates and costs of doing business. And yes, these are there for all communities. But think about it from a Toronto context, where our 10-year capital plan is $50 billion. And really, some of the issues that are on that left side of the slide that you're looking at, our fiscal challenges that we've experienced for a while, have been mitigated by low interest environments, by the fact that we haven't had these acute labor and supply chain issues over time as we see today. And so because of that financial environment changing and worsening significantly, because we have had long-standing structural fiscal issues, we needed to take action and we needed to think about ways that we could implement new tools and engage our federal and provincial partners in new ways. In March, we shared the scope of the crisis, and that leads us to today with a report of how will we start to take some action. While the $46.5 billion is the issue that we're dealing with over the next decade, there are two numbers which are our immediate area of focus. One confronts us in less than 6 months, and that is our 2024 budget. We currently look at a $1.5 billion pressure as an opening pressure. We will need to mitigate that, and unlike the current budget year that we're in for 2023, without support, our backstop, which was there to allow us to balance our budget in 2023, will not be available in 2024. The second piece is our capital needs over the next 10 years, nearly $30 billion, of which over half is related to our transit services. These are critical areas that we need new deals, we need new ways of working with the provincial and federal government. There simply is not a pathway locally that we can get to a stronger point of sustainability. So Toronto has stepped up. Oftentimes, as you may have heard, the question is, well, what is Toronto doing? Is this simply an ask of someone else to come and help? And the answer to that is no. Over past years, we have increased property tax rates, recognizing that is a portion of the solution to our financial needs. There is a municipal land transfer tax that was introduced following the introduction of special powers here in the City of Toronto some years ago. We've increased the municipal accommodation tax, and we have, always trying to balance off the ability to pay, looked at increasing user fees, including TTC fares. We've done some innovative work. Council has committed to the City Building Fund, and this often doesn't get a lot of press, but it is one of the game-changing pieces that Council has endorsed. By going for another 10 years with the City Building Fund, we'll be able to leverage that to the tune of nearly $6 billion in investments. And then, of course, we've done innovative work with green and social bonds. We're a leader in this country in looking at how we can continue to ask the capital markets to support our work in terms of our capital plan. We have invested those resources in priorities that matter to Torontonians and our key priorities of our council, and that includes transit. And it's important to recognize that the base subsidy for the TTC from the City of Toronto's tax base is now just over $1 billion. And we've increased our investments in housing and are doing our part to figure out how we can continue to build more houses quicker, including reorganizing our administrative structure starting in the next month or so that we can approve applications in an even faster format to allow people to build the housing that our communities need. I'm now going to turn things over to our interim Chief Financial Officer, Steve Conforti, to take you through some of the work that we did leading up to the release of this report, but to also illustrate why it's so important that we continue our conversations with the province and the federal government because we will not be able to do this alone.
Thanks, Paul. And I thank everyone here for attending today. As expressed in the report, and with the magnitude of the financial pressures the city faces over the next decade, there is no one single solution that can address the city's financial challenges. Staff are recommending a series of options that collectively can mitigate and reduce the fiscal pressure. We're also fortunate to benefit to some degree from past actions. About 10% of our financial pressure can actually be addressed through actions that are already underway. The most significant, and by far, of these being the City Building Fund, and specifically Council's endorsement of extending the annual increase to this dedicated levy until the year 2035. This enables us to grow the funding source that's dedicated towards critical transit and housing infrastructure needs. Building on past actions, the long-term financial plan includes recommendations to further reduce the city's fiscal pressure, many of which focus on opportunities that are within the city's control to implement. In total, we've broken out these options into 5 categories. First is augmenting existing revenue tools. This includes developing a multi-year approach to establishing property tax rates, as well as introducing a graduated municipal land transfer tax rate on high-value residential properties. Second, we've brought forward new revenue tools along with changes to policy tools. This includes recommendations associated with a commercial parking levy and the introduction of a foreign buyer land transfer tax. Additionally, we're recommending changes to policy tools, including the feasibility of increasing the vacant home tax from a 1% of assessed property value to 3%. Third is options on expenditures and foregone revenues, specifically the removal of certain development charge exemptions applied to non-ground floors of non-residential properties, and the review of financial incentive programs, or to be technical, tax increment equivalent grants offered by the city. Our fourth category speaks to the review of surplus and underutilized assets, coupled with a strategy for potential disposition or change in use of specific assets that ensures the greatest value for the city. And lastly, there are further actions staff will undertake to both further reduce the fiscal pressure, but also mitigate against added growth to our financial challenges. This includes continued procurement strategies with a focus towards enhancing regional procurement opportunities, as well as enhancing citywide prioritization framework for our capital program to be in place for the 2025 budget process. The challenge is that applying the full suite of options will not be enough to address the city's $46.5 billion pressure. Ultimately, subject to council approvals, we estimate that the city alone can only address about 40% of the pressure. On top of that, and what's become very evident through this exercise, is that options that the city has full authority to implement are generally limited to property ownership. This holds true for property taxes, various land transfer taxes, vacant home tax, and even parking levies that are ultimately attributed to property ownership. To address the remaining 60% of our financial pressures, the city needs a new fiscal framework with the federal and provincial government. We are asking council to seek authority from the province to implement new revenue tools that are reflective of the city's responsibilities and contributions to the economy, and specifically a municipal sales tax that applies to the purchases of goods and services in the city. Also, we're seeking a new fiscal framework with the provincial and federal government, one that provides fair contributions to critical services we provide that either offer regional benefits across the GTHA or are delivered as extensions of the federal and provincial governments. The focus of this being on transit, housing, and shelter services. And Paul has previously noted, actions must occur in many ways and must be supported by all levels of the government. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to our city manager.
So our key message today is that it's about everyone stepping up and working together. And, you know, we have a great example of that through the crisis period of the pandemic. This city, as cities and communities across Canada, simply would not have survived without the investments of their provincial and the federal governments. And Ontario was no exception. Toronto was no exception. And so we're incredibly thankful for those contributions. The City of Toronto also did its part. Over the course of those pandemic years, the city found ways to mitigate spending to the tune of about $2.5 billion.
Well, you've been watching live coverage of Toronto's city manager unveiling his thoughts of how to bridge the city's massive budget gap.
And our hope is that those
Once again, we're listening to City Manager Paul Johnson providing an update on the city's long-term financial plan. Let's listen in live.
Internally, we need to take the measures. I need to take the measures administratively that we need to do as an organization. Council will have to wrestle with what actions they will take immediately, and that's why this special meeting has been called by the mayor for next week. And then we'll also need some action from the provincial and federal governments to help mitigate some of those potentials.
Do you have a follow-up? And do you mind saying your name and affiliation just for the record, please?
Yeah, it was Bepping with Global News. I'm
Okay.
kind of fine with just a free flow chat. So.
Okay, please. Yep, go ahead.
Hi, Natalie Johnson, CTV News. Mr. Johnson, it feels like after many years of asking the province and Ottawa nicely for a fiscal framework and hoping that this would be negotiation, we've arrived at the point where there's a bit more of an ultimatum, where you're saying to the province, you know, we won't build these long-term care beds, we'll talks on transit expansion. Would you agree that the tone has now become closer to that level of ultimatum?
The term I'd use is urgency, but I think it is now very real. We simply can't move forward on some things. The terminology we often use around here is we need to stop digging. Until we've got ourselves on a more solid footing, we can't add to that issue. So if increases in long-term care results in 20% of that operating being the responsibility of property taxes and the property taxpayer, those are the types of things. So it's about expansion right now, not contraction, but it is that urgency. So I never liked the term ultimatum personally, but I think what I would say is these are much more urgent, and we are putting specific timeframes and also specific initiatives on the table. So it is less ethereal, the conversation, and more real.
Over in C24, Vancouver just increased their property taxes by 10.7%. Are we close to getting something like that?
So property taxes will be part of the solution. Obviously, the mayor will discern what direction she provides under our framework around the 2024 budget and beyond. What we are asking for as staff is we would really like to see a more predictable, at least over this term of council, approach to property taxes so we can plan. We have some ways. Part of the exercise will be to smooth out the challenges over a few years. Property taxes will allow us to plan, but in terms of what that level will be, that would be part of our discussions in 2024.
Okay, at the back.
We've been listening to the city manager, Paul Johnson, providing an update on the city's long-term financial plan, talking about the variation property-based revenue tools that the city will be looking at, considering that they have a massive budget shortfall. They're looking at new ways to try and raise money other than just property-based revenue tools. We're going to have a lot more on this throughout the morning and afternoon. 10:55, 23 degrees. This is Toronto's breaking news, CP24. As we've been talking, Toronto's massive budget gap is taking center stage today at City Hall as the city manager releases his list of new taxes for councillors to consider.
Taking you back live now to Toronto City Hall, where City Manager Paul Johnson providing an update on the city's long-term financial plan, giving councillors some options to deal with the budget deficit. Let's listen live again.
You know, there may be other discussions that happen. This is not the end of the discussion. This was what can we get going on quickly and move forward on. We did think, however, reviewing the work of EY and talking about it as staff, that it is time to push forward on the discussion on growth-related revenue sharing and a new framework in terms of some of these critical services, more so than having that discussion, because again, we can't unilaterally implement those road tolls. So when we're going and having those intergovernmental relationships and discussions, we wanted to focus on growth-related revenue and a new deal in terms of some of those critical service delivery models. And so that was the reason that those appear in there. But I would say that we're A, open to other ideas that council may have, and B, probably going to continue to look at ideas about how we continue to advance sustainability moving forward.
Follow-up?
Yeah, just on the development charge exemption issue. So my understanding is that at the moment, like 40 tower sky or 40-story skyscraper are taking as much as like a power wash development. Well, what's been the rationale for that exemption? And given that would generate $190 million a year, like would that help wipe out the effects of the provincial development charge sheets, for instance? Like, is that helpful for any that would provide a lot of business?
So I can start in terms of the exemption itself. So it's an exemption, essentially development charges are only paid on the ground floor. So anything below or above are exempt on a development, and it was generally you would see that in office towers and developments like that. There is a graph that you'll see in the report that speaks to what we relatively would have collected compared to GTA municipalities for 40-story buildings. In terms of it being an item that can offset the impacts of the DC changes, not necessarily. So it would mean that there's additional revenue that could come forward. I think one of the challenges that we see as a result of Bill 23 is the eligibility of affordable housing as a DC eligible service. So regardless of the amount of DCs you're collecting, you would never collect for that eligible service under the changes, nor be able to apply the funds to move forward on those projects.
So what's the rationale for the current exemption?
So the rationale, and this has been in place for this is a long-standing approach to be able to be an incentive in terms of spurring commercial development.
And I think the same holds true, Ben, when we look at the tax increment financing one, the IMIT program, as we call it around here. Again, at a time, serve good value. We're reviewing that, and we're asked to review it anyways. And I think these are the types of choices we're making, where perhaps the argument and the evidence to support those, it's changed. Toronto is a different place. And so it's not just about picking things to cut because, we had a list and we decided to choose a couple. We are trying to be very strategic. Anything we do, we know has an impact on people, it has an impact on business, and we're trying to balance that. So in areas where perhaps the rationale is less strong today than it was in the past, these were the ones that we're looking at. And so the two that are in there, which are major changes to programs that provided incentives, were done so with a lot of that analysis in mind.
Okay, thank you.
So,
right here.
Phil Perkins again from CP24. You talked about game-changing, you take that term. So what would a game-changing new deal be with the province and the federal government to help with the situation?
So the first piece would be access to growth-related revenue. We've focused in a bit on sales tax. The other piece would be to look at some income tax sharing if that's possible. And then the second is let's look at these huge programs which have a huge impact, both capital and operating. And they fall into a couple of big categories. The first is transit. And that is really talking about how will we fund, and not fund on a project by project, or not fund on a, well, we need more this year and we'll come back a couple years later, but at a base level, how will we fund it? And the great news, and why we're talking about some of these, is they are not foreign concepts. The federal government is right now having consultations around their permanent transit fund. So they are contemplating how they will be a stronger investor in transit across this country. We think there's a bit more urgency here in the city of Toronto, and we also believe that we have a unique place because of the size and complexity of the TTC.
Although, no, go ahead.
Okay, Natalie at City Hall Ledger. Recommendation 10 talks about long-term care beds that the city is basically a the province that you're not going to go forward with 178 beds. Can you talk a bit about sort of the value of that operating capital and what is the change here?
So the change on the long-term care beds is that without a discussion on how we will fully fund the capital and better fund the operating, we're not going to proceed with expansion. So it doesn't save us anything in the budget, but there are pieces of this work we're doing which is about stop digging. We cannot take on large projects that have a huge hit. And when you think about, I don't have the numbers to hand, but you can see it in our budget book with the beds we already have within our system. If you think about the operating costs of nearly 1,000 new long-term care beds, the 20% share, give or take, that we would be contributing is again something that would be an added pressure on top of all the added pressures. So it pains us deeply. We would love to expand our system. Council has consistently been very supportive of our long-term system, and we're not saying we never want to expand. We're saying we cannot expand unless we have that discussion about how we're going to achieve a different deal in terms of how we both fund the operating and the capital portion of that.
Follow-up, we're talking long-term today, but short-term obviously is a major concern as well financially. For like the gap expected for the end of this year, for the gap for the beginning of next year, are there specific strategies in this report or outside this report that you're looking at? Is internal borrowing something that is being considered?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the report itself, it definitely does bring opportunities forward to be able to address the challenges we're facing as early as 2024. In terms of the pressure in 2023, we had a variance report that had gone to council about a month ago or so, and it identified that we still have about $845 million in unfunded COVID pressures. The strategy on that remains to continue to be the same. It's going to be reliance on the COVID backstop, absent of any further funding. The challenge that creates is it essentially nearly depletes the backstop and doesn't have that resource available as we enter into the 2024 budget process. As we look in 2024, there are recommendations in here that support the strategy as it relates to the $1.5 billion pressure. The first being is looking at a multi-year approach to a property tax that gives us the ability to plan and strategize not just in a one-year basis, but over a multi-year approach. We're also then looking at the graduated land transfer tax with revenues available as early as 2024, as well as the implementation of other tools that you may see revenues flow in the tail end, mid to tail end of 2024 that would also be leveraged to be able to support the pressures that we're facing.
In the back?
So when it comes to the parking levy, the report is coming quickly. It's, I guess, would be part of our budget cycle. So that's going to be coming in the next few months. Really, the 2025 date is when we can legitimately expect to start to see that revenue flow. So the ramp up of that program and all the rest is not going to, in our initial analysis, provide a revenue source in 2024. We kick in 2025.
18 months time.
We're told it's 12 to 18 months to implement, and that's why it's 2025. We'll try and expedite that on the 12-month side of things, but we're just not confident that we should be placing any hope on that for 2024. And that's, the nature of this report. Not everything in here was about 2024. That's a budget discussion. This is about 10 years, but everything in it is about the fastest possible implementation of these things. Some of them simply can't be implemented within 2 or 3 months. The ones that that can will be. And again, that's why meeting in August, endorsement of whatever council feels are the right actions to take in September so that we can start working on implementation.
Do you have follow-up?
Yeah, to confirm, so this report assumes that the reserve fund will be completely completed this year. So what impact does that have on city finances and emergency?
So as it relates to the COVID backstop specifically, we do expect heading into the 2024 budget, it'll be nearly depleted. There might be 100, 200 million left in the reserve, but not adequate to be able to support the ongoing sustained impacts of the pandemic. The challenge that creates and the luxury that the backstop had provided in the past years is we had taken an approach where we would seek federal and provincial support against those costs with the ability to then rely on the backstop if they weren't forthcoming. Heading into 2024, that luxury is now gone, and it means that we need to bring forward opportunities and strategies that have the budget balanced from the time it's approved by council, meaning we will have to look at revenue measures, expenditure measures, and everything else that's identified in the report.
When it comes to, a lot has been made over the years over the tax rate and the way it's been kept at or below the rate of inflation. How much of this current financial peril would you say is actually, split down between that former approach to taxing in Toronto versus the pandemic itself?
I think just by the basic math, you can't say we're in this position overall because of the property tax rates over the years. Certainly Ernst & Young did some analysis of property tax rates around, and there may be a 10% gap or so in the greater Toronto area that one could argue to fill. But to look back on that, that's not how you could generate the kind of revenue that you would need. It is about this structural challenge we have in Toronto in terms of the needs we have from a service level, and particularly the capital investments. So we recognize that property taxes are part of the solution. They always will be, and they should be. That's the piece that Toronto will have to deal with. But when 1% is 40 million, and you're looking at an annual budget of 16 billion, and I recognize that includes lots of investment from other orders of government, but the billions that we need on a year-by-year basis, there isn't a property tax regime that would have solved this, so we wouldn't be sitting here in 2023 talking about this.
Sean?
Okay, so we're listening live down at City Hall as we're trying to figure out ways to come up with ways to manage and deal with Toronto's current $1 billion deficit to its budget. Lots of proposals there, lots of questions being asked of the city planners there. So we'll keep checking in back live at Toronto City Council throughout the morning here.